Hi, this is Paul. There was a very interesting posting from Rebel Wisdom on an addiction specialist, Gabor Mate. I assume that's how to say his name. I didn't know anything about him. I read the free Amazon sample from his book. The book sounds very interesting. I've had a fair amount of experience with addicts, given where my church is and the ministry that I've had. And so I find the topic very interesting, and I found the interviews very interesting, and I wanted to do a little bit of commenting on some of it and play a few clips. So, well, let's dive in.
Gabor Mate is a world-famous expert on addiction. In his book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts,
That's a great title.
He talks about how addiction is best viewed not as a crime or an illness, but as a coping mechanism for a personal, spiritual crisis.
Now, right away, when he started this way, it obviously had my attention. AA, of course, popularized the notion of especially alcoholism as a disease. And I've often pondered that, because even categorizing something as a disease locates it within our frame in a particular place. And so the categorization of alcoholism as a disease obviously had the intended consequence of lifting the degree of moralistic guilt that many alcoholics have been plagued with. Now, that's very, very complicated, because obviously it's just very complicated. And I think it shows we don't know how to think about ourselves, even with some things that are basic and common to us, and we don't know how to categorize them. And so I thought right away David's introduction to this, grabbed my attention right away. So let's keep listening.
Addiction is a response to human suffering. It's an attempt of a human being to feel actually normal.
I thought that was a tremendous observation.
And so rather than a disease or a choice, it really is a coping mechanism.
Now, how do we categorize a coping mechanism? That's because a choice places it in a moral context. A disease places it in a therapeutic context, and into a certain sense takes away agency from the person. If I have cancer, I don't feel liable for it, unless, of course, I can directly tie causation to, let's say, smoking or eating poorly or some other cause that we might. But if it's, let's say, genetics, well, then I can blame. I mean, it just shows how difficult agency is. And so what he's doing here is saying, and I think it's a brilliant. It's got a degree of obviousness to it that it's a coping mechanism, because if you've had a relationship with an addict in one way or another, you know that stress brings on and tempts people back into addiction, even if they've been in recovery. This is something that's common knowledge. So it's a coping mechanism. Well, is a coping mechanism an illness? Well, no, not really. Is it a choice? Well, it just shows how complicated choice has become for our current frame.
Social media, there's been a lot in the press around our addiction to social media. So what do you feel drives that, or our unhealthy relationship with it? Is it the same dynamics? Is there more to it?
Well, you can use social media responsibly, just as you can exercise responsibly, or you can exercise addictively, or you can use social media addictively. So it's the internal relationship to them, these activities, that defines whether they're addictive or not. Now, if you're using something for temporary relief or pain relief or pleasure, and you crave it despite negative consequences, you go on addiction.
Okay, right there is his definition of addiction. And again, I think it's a really helpful definition, but I don't know that it's definitive, in the sense that I don't know that it completely captures it. So something, let's say, for temporary relief is okay. Something that, well, let's listen to what he says again.
And you crave for finds whether addictive or not. Now, If you're using something for temporary relief or pain relief or pleasure, and you crave it.
So the craving, I mean, that's almost begging the question in terms of addiction, because that's almost the definition of addiction.
Despite negative consequences.
Okay, despite negative consequences. Well, taking almost any medication has the potential for negative consequences, side effects we call them. So, and this is an MD, at least to the degree that I could look him up and figure out his background. So it's a really nice definition, and I can see how it's really useful and really handy, but I'm not quite settled on it.
You've got an addiction. Whereas if you're using social media not to escape emotional distress, not because you're craving it, but simply because it's a useful modality, and you don't suffer negative consequences, then it's not an addiction.
And again, the negative consequences is just kind of out there. Where I'm going with this is, I want to ask questions. Oh, maybe I'll just jump into the slide right away. We have a crisis of purpose in the secular frame, and this now purpose and meaning are pretty closely, are terms that are quite close together. Purpose, let's say, it's an existential philosophical category. Meaning seems more existential philosophical plus emotional, so perhaps meaning is a little bigger. And of course, for the Peterson conversation, meaning is a very big thing. And we are one of the things that I've been talking about has been the difficulty of purpose in the existential frame. We can look at via science what a thing is, what it is made of, but for example, if you look at the 4 Aristotelian causes, we have a lot of difficulty with that in the secular frame. We have difficulty saying, well, we can say these are the effects of something, but we have difficulty with the purpose of something. And often, if I'm trying to diagnose or analyze something within our frame, I will ask, what is it for? So we've had a robust conversation about marriage in our culture, same-sex marriage, whether monogamy is tyrannical, things like this. Well, at some point you have to ask the question, well, what is it for? What is marriage for? What is human sexuality for? Right away, you run into the brick wall that science cannot tell you what something is for. It might be able to talk about causes and processes that lead to outcomes, but what it can't get at is one of these causes, which is intent, because intent always implies mind. And so if you listen to scientists talking about biology, genes especially, you'll hear often Brett Weinstein talking about what genes want. Well, once you introduce the word want into a conversation, you introduce mind and intent. Now they'll often put qualifications on, well, we don't really mean intend. And again, with the Sam Harris conversations with Jordan Peterson, if you listen to those, Sam Harris regularly lapses into assumptions of intent with non-agency or non-personal actors, impersonal actors. Can you really talk about intent in that way? Now you might say, well, this is simply a relic of language that we can't get rid of. Well, then we're prisoners to these relics. And so what it looks like to me, and I've drawn this three-sided rectangle before about our situation in the secular frame, that you have idealism from above, how things ought to be, authority that comes from above. You have empiricism and experience from below. Science talks about how things are or how they work, but science can't really tell you what something is for, because for implies intent and purpose. And so this question of meaning, purpose, this is all bound up into this. So now in the secular frame, we have the past, which is history, which is to a degree available to empirical means, but the future is not. And it's the future that you have all of these terms such as purpose, meaning, telos, which is Greek meaning ends, and ends in Greek has the same dual meaning as it does in English. For example, the shorter Westminster Catechism, the first question and answer is, what is the chief end of man? What do you mean by that? What is the chief end? Well, it's got this dual meaning where on one hand it's a temporal end, and it's also purposeful. And you'll see how this is all tied into our language at a very, very deep level. So we don't really get away from it. This is where we get into the eschaton, which is last things, or the last times, or where things are going. And when we look at, when we as human beings think about our lives, we are always leaning towards the future. Charles Taylor writes about this in his book, The Secular Age, how secularism always sort of leans us to the future. And I think the reason we do that is because we have now a skeptical approach towards things from above, idealism, how things ought to be. We're skeptical of that. And so what we really get reduced to are sort of the back end of the rectangle and the bottom of the rectangle. And so then we try to lean towards the future for this purposes, this telos, this meaning, because hoping that maybe in the future the meaning of the present will be known. And this is the bind we find ourselves in the secular frame. Now when you get into addiction, as we're getting into in this conversation, well, what this author is making the point is that addiction is a function not simply of, let's say, a genetic disposition, not simply of, well, a lack of willpower, because those are the two poles that he's resisting. But addiction has everything to do with how the self is located within their world story. Now, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately on Jung, and when I read Jung's autobiography a while ago, and one of my chief takeaways from his autobiography was his awareness of how the story we live in, the metaphysical story we live in, is deeply connected to our emotional state. And again, I was pondering this with respect to my sister. My sister's death did not impact her car. My sister's car is not grieving the loss of her. Now, sometimes we might project that onto the car. The car isn't running well, and so the car is mourning. But most of us don't buy this, and certainly not Sam Harris or Matt Dillahunty. They won't buy that. But I am her brother, and I am mourning the loss of my sister. Well, why? In what way am I connected to her in a way that her car was not? Well, I am a very different thing than her car is. And so, one of Jung's great observations, so in his autobiography, he writes about the fact that he's a young doctor and he starts working in a mental hospital, and he wants to talk to the patients, and his mentors and supervisors say, well, don't talk to the patients because they're all crazy. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, that's kind of the whole business of the mental hospital is. And they're all crazy. They all have diseases. And so and of course this is the beginning of the 20th century, they don't have medicines to help these mental patients with their diseases, so there's no point in talking to them. In a sense, like there's no point in me talking to my sister's car. Well, now we have these things where I compare my cell phone by talking to the car, but you understand what I mean. So the doctors, the mentors and supervisors of Jung said there's no point in talking to these people because they're crazy. They've got a disease, and so there's no talking them out of it. And Jung's kind of like, well, he's a young doctor and he's obviously a brilliant guy. So he starts talking to people on the sly, and he begins to notice when he talks to them that, yeah, they're crazy, but they're not disconnected, and that they're different kinds of illness, that the stories of themselves are tied to these larger world stories. And that's where he gets into, looking at religion and comparative religions and all these kinds of things, that there's a deep connection in terms of the story within us and the stories out there. And he begins to postulate that perhaps by working these stories, we can, in fact, help people who, especially with the beginning of 20th century medicine, may or may not have what we'd call a disease, but by adjusting these stories, that, in fact, inner health could be found and people's lives could be improved. Now even that idea of improving a life is not a simple or easy notion, because again we have this idea of, well, what does it mean for a person's life to be improved? Now obviously if they're an alcoholic and they're drinking all the time and they're neglecting their children and they're abusing their spouse, that improvement, as Sam Harris would note in terms of well-being, improvement doesn't seem to be a very difficult thing to think about. Improvement would be no longer abusing your spouse. Improvement would be no longer neglecting your children. And so what we can find is calibrations within life that seem to work fairly well, but we're always a little bit fuzzy on whether those calibrations how far those calibrations can go out. And I think about Jordan Peterson's comments about the resurrection. He often wonders, well, if we know how bad things can get, maybe we really don't know how good things can get, especially because good is really hard to maintain. Bad is really easy to come by. So that's where he questions, the resurrection of Jesus and ponders that and is unwilling, unless he's under the cross-examination of Sam Harris on a stage in front of a whole bunch of people in Vancouver, he's not willing to give up on the possibility of a resurrection. So back to this conversation. So the question here about addiction is a curious one, because we can know that someone's life could be better if they would drink less. And they would say, well, their life can handle maybe having a drink at night or a glass of wine with the meal, but having 5, 10, 15, or 20 beers, or drinking that entire bottle of vodka is going to seriously incapacitate the person. And as people would know, let's say something like Alcoholics Anonymous, it's a very interesting move that the 12-step makes when they say, on one hand, well, let's say alcoholism as a disease, but we're not going to treat it as we tend to treat most diseases at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, where we give people chemicals into their body to address the disease. Someone, and I'm sure it'll come up in the comment section, someone said that someone drew a connection between Jung and the origins of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know about that connection. So if you do know about that connection, put something in the comment section for me. I didn't just think about it until now. Because what's interesting is that, in a sense, Alcoholics Anonymous is kind of a combination between accountability and the talking cure. In a 12-step program, you talk and you talk and you talk and you talk. And as you work through the 12 steps, you attempt to not only, your problem isn't simply that you drink too much alcohol. Your problem is all around in your life. And that's very similar to Jung's observation that the story within and the story without, if these two stories are not synchronizing well, there's going to be dysfunction. And now Mate is an MD who talks a little bit about the fact that his addictions and so on and so forth, well, in a sense, shalom, the stories outside and the story within, all need to be in concert, all need to be in sync, all need to be working together appropriately to have a human being flourishing, even in the small frame calibrations that we think about. Okay? And so now here Ali is asking Gabor about social media, and social media if you listen again to Jonathan Haidt, we'll note that there are real issues with social media in terms of well-being, and this is something that we can use. We can tolerate it in small degrees, but it can easily get out of whack. And you might ask, well, is addiction to social media a disease? Well, now suddenly in a lot of our frames of reference, we begin to ask questions. Well, what exactly is a disease? Because when I say I have cancer or I have a thyroid condition, I might think of that as within a chemical sphere, within a physical chemical interaction. But the disease of social media would be a disease much more in the storyverse. And now we're getting into this observation that Jung made about the stories out there and the stories in here, and how they align. And again, as I was immediately grabbed by David's introduction to this video and this conversation with him, beginning to try to process, okay, how does it work for this guy? So let's listen to a little bit more.
So it's not the external behavior. I mean, you can drink alcohol non-addictively. You can have sex non-addictively. You can go shopping non-addictively. Or you can engage in all those activities in a purely compulsive, addictive fashion.
And again, compulsive, addictive, these are all synonyms. And in terms of theological conversation, we get into, let's say, idolatry, that some lesser good becomes the dominant good in a person's life. This gets into St. Augustine and his conversations about ordered loves. And so for Augustine and many people who followed Augustine after that, Augustine talked about your loves have to be in order. Now, put it into Jordan Peterson frame, there's a hierarchy of loves, and in your hierarchy of loves, those loves have to be in proper order. And if those loves are not in proper order, your life is going to be disordered. And so let's say for an addict, let's say an alcoholic, alcohol becomes the dominant passion of the person's life. And that then, because all the other loves are disordered, because alcohol should not be governing a human being, then you have a problem. But that, if you see it that way, you begin to ask questions about, well, if there must be a structure to the world, to a human being, that says that alcohol should not be the master of a human being, that alcohol is a perfectly fine servant of a human being, but not its master. Now suddenly you're into questions about natural law and natural order, because, well, in what way, in what hierarchy, in what schema do human beings and alcohol relate to one another? And if that's true with respect to alcohol, isn't it also true with respect to not only other things, world as space of objects, other things in the world, but also relationships with other persons in the world? And okay, so my relationship with my wife is different than my relationship with my children, and that's going to be sorted out somehow. But let's say my relationship with my wife has to be of a certain status higher than, let's say, relationships with, let's say, other women. And there needs to be a priority there. And if that priority gets out of whack, well, you're going to have a problem. You know, even in terms of Genesis 2, where the man leaves his mother and father and cleaves to his wife. Well, there you're setting up a priority. You can see that this conversation about addiction, part of what's so interesting about it and what's so important about it is not only the therapeutic and pastoral application about it, but also the way that this is a conversation that leads our way into theology and leads our way into thinking about, well, what are the structures of the world? Why is a human being supposed to be master of alcohol and not the other way around? And the same with social media.
Depending what the internal dynamic is. Does it provide temporary pleasure, pain relief? Do you crave it? And
do you crave it? And every time he says that, it's kind of, you're begging the question on the addiction thing. The question isn't just do you crave it, do you give into your cravings? And then the question is, what is you? And what is choice? And you can see why addiction is a terribly difficult thing for us to figure out.
You continue with it despite negative consequences. That's what tells you whether it's an addiction.
Okay, and negative consequences. Well, let's say if you drink too much one evening and you wake up the next day and you say, oh, that's, I shouldn't have done that. Well, I'm not a drinker, but I could maybe relate to this, that I'm watching I'm a sucker for history documentaries. And so I'm watching a history I have weird addictions. I'm watching history documentaries, or here's a better addiction. I'm playing Civilization, and it's 11 o'clock at night, and my wife's gone to bed, and it's like, I can play more Civilization, just one more turn. And I play Civilization, and I go to 12 o'clock, and I'm still playing the Civilization. I go to 1 o'clock, I'm still playing Civilization. It's like, I got to get up and go to work the next day. I've got stuff to do. So finally at 1:30, I close the computer and I go to bed, and I wake up the next morning. It's like, oh, I'm tired. That's a negative consequence to playing Civilization till 1 o'clock in the morning. Now, am I an addict to Civilization? Well, now we're getting into questions of extreme. And so the next night, let's say I start playing Civilization. And I say, 11 o'clock, I'm turning the computer off and I'm stopping Civilization and I'm going to bed. And I do it. But then a few months later, I stay up too late and I play Civilization till 1 in the morning, and I wake up the next morning and, oh, why did I stay up so late? So am I an addict? Well, this is part of what's difficult about addiction because, well, how often do I do it? Am I losing my job because I'm playing Civilization? No. I haven't played Civilization in weeks, actually, but now that I'm talking about it, part of me in my brain is thinking, oh, Civilization, that's a fun game. Maybe you should play it tonight. And then I'm going to get back into the cycle. So this is hard stuff to figure out. And his definition, are there negative consequences? Well, how profound are the negative consequences?
Now, broadly speaking, social media are highly addictive, and a lot of people are addicted, and it having a devastating effect on their lives. But not, of course, everybody.
Especially on social media, but just in general, this polarization seems to be increasingly ideological. You mentioned people are...
I like these Rebel Wisdom guys. They came to Living Stones, and they hung out with me, and they're just sweet guys. And I don't know, I like people. What can I say? So, Ollie and Dave, cool guys. Really enjoy them.
Really in their specific tribes, and speaking from, let's have a chance to hate the other tribe. Can we be addicted to ideology?
Well, again, if you define addiction as I do, as any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure or relief in, suffers negative consequences, and cannot give up despite negative consequences, that's an addiction. Again, I don't care whether it's sex, gambling, ideology, or cocaine. And the brain circuits are the same. The same brain circuits are involved in all the addictions. So we think there's all these different addictions. If you actually look at the addicted brain, it's the same brain circuitry that's involved in all addictions. So an ideology that allows you free expression of your impulses. You will get to hit somebody if you're angry. You get to throw a rock through somebody's window, or a verbal bomb to their personal sense of self. If you're lacking a sense of personal power, but the ideology gives you a pseudo-empowerment, now you belong to something really important. If there's no meaning in your life, and the ideology gives you a pseudo-meaning,
See, I love this section because here, okay, an ideology. Well, what is an ideology? Well, an ideology is a story. The ideology of Nazism is the story of racial progress. Ideology of Marxism is the story of class progress. Ideology is a story. You can be addicted to a story. So is it a disease? Well, it depends what you mean by a disease. Depends what you mean by any of these categories. Fun interview, and watch more of it. I'm going to play a little bit more of it later because, of course, David gets him to talk about Jordan Peterson a little bit later, and some of those comments are very interesting. But here you have the question. Okay, well, what is an addiction? You see, you can't really answer the question of addiction unless you actually grapple with the question of telos, of purpose, of meaning. Is the purpose and meaning of a human being to have a great, to be deliriously happy and have an amazing emotional sense of euphoria? And Peterson, of course, wades in with his most common example of cocaine. Well, you can do a lot of cocaine and just, have a very short life and just be deliriously happy until you overdose and die. Well, is that the purpose of a human being? You see, all of these questions are nested within far bigger stories and purposes about what, in fact, is a life. What is the good life? Now, you can get into some Dallas Willard through this, and I'm not going to play any of his videos on this video, but these are the questions that Dallas Willard just keeps asking people. He's saying, well, you can't answer any of these questions without asking basic questions about what is the good life? What are people for? That gets very, you can't answer that question without a worldview, which is why materialism just gets shallow fast, because you're left trying to wade in the pond of human experience. And what these grand stories, what religions do, and ideologies to a degree, and we'll get into them a little bit later in this video, is they give the context for the human being. Now, Peterson, Peterson notes in a number of times, and the Peterson search engine is no longer up, and I used to use that all the time, so I kind of miss it. But I'm sure someone was just doing it out of the goodness of their heart and was costing them money, and at some point they pulled the plug on it, or maybe it was copyright people. I don't know. So I couldn't find in Maps of Meaning or the Biblical Series or any of those some of these passages where Peterson talks about the fact that one way for people to leave addiction or to be freed from addiction is by having a religious conversion experience. And this is essentially what 12-step programs, what AA has majored in. If you look at the 12 steps, it's a fairly systematized way of delivering what, a fair amount of Christian theology underneath them. What the first step does is kind of locate the human being and figure out where the human being is. Because if you can relocate the human being in a much more healthy, much more true sense in terms of the person's where they stand in an existential, ontological, natural order, some of these smaller calibrations within us, such as how much we drink, how long we play civilization, some of these things will be ordered more correctly, and in fact the whole life will be ordered more correctly. If you look at say situations where certain substance abuse issues have become rampant in a civilization, often it's after trauma, and this guy will actually talk about this a little bit later in the Rebel Wisdom video. That trauma, Bessel van der Kolk, I think that's his name. The Body Keeps the Score. Terrific book if you haven't read it. Talks a lot about trauma. Talks a lot about, his focus isn't so much on addiction. His focus is on trauma. Mate's focus is on addiction, but he gets into trauma, and so he gets into how these two things are related. And a little bit later, David's going to ask him about Jung and about that. But so Peterson talks about the fact that one of the ways that you can break addictions is with a religious conversion. Now that's complicated because, as many people have discovered, let's say they were an alcoholic, they went into a 12-step program, they had a religious conversion, maybe they went all the way over into Christianity. I've met people in churches who started out in 12-step program, wanted some greater definition to their higher power. In a sense, they wanted a richer, fuller world that they could inhabit, so then they came into the church. Some people, once they, in a sense, licked alcohol, they could easily come into the church and live within recovery fairly easily. Other people might have found in a religious conversion a temporary reprieve, but they kept having slips, they kept backsliding into their addictions, and they lived within a continual struggle with their addictions, sometimes less victoriously than others. Let's use that language. So this business about addiction and the big story is in fact a very interesting and difficult one. Now, Peterson in this clip talks a bit about addiction and telos. And this, I think, is from one of his biblical lectures.
So
I found it on a clip site.
Through the rise of the smartphone, and my question basically relates to procrastination and task delay, needless task delay specifically.
See, and you might ask, well, are these addictions? And it's like, well, we wouldn't categorize them as addictions, but they certainly are cravings with negative consequences.
And given the unprecedented level of distraction that we have in today's world, I just wanted to get your perspective from a psychological standpoint on, other than cleaning your damn room, what would you suggest to a student who's looking to overcome these things?
Well, I think with any, let's call it addictive process, I mean, email is powerfully addictive, right? Partly, it's a slot machine, and I mean that technically. So when you pull, that's a very...
This is probably a good illustration at the early parts of his status rocket rise, because he starts getting tons of emails, and then which ones do you open? And which ones do you respond to?
Variable ratio reinforcement schedule, if I remember correctly. And it's very addictive because if you pull on the slot machine arm enough, you will win. And you never know which pull will reward you. And so not only is that addictive, it's very hard to extinguish that. And so...
And the backlog of emails I've got, I'm not feeling much addiction towards them. Sorry. Many of you have written me, expressed your condolences. I deeply appreciate them, and hopefully I can get back and respond to all of you personally. But yeah, I'm not feeling a lot of addiction towards email in my life at the moment.
Emails like that, because there's always something beckoning, and now and then it's a jackpot. And social media is like that because, you know, people are posting interesting things. And so, well, how do you overcome an addictive process? And partly, you do it by replacing it with something better, right? So, when...
Now, this idea of replacing it with something better is actually there was a 19th or 18th century Reformed pastor. Shoot, I should have queued this up. This is why I do PowerPoint, to have this stuff. And I thought about this morning. Basically, what it talks about is that, and this is before AA, before any of this therapeutic language, basically it used theological language, and it essentially said exactly what Peterson says here, is that if you have a problem in your life, the only way to dislodge that knotty problem, like an addiction, is to find a stronger problem to drive it out. And this, in fact, is weighing on Jesus' parable of cleaning the house. That once you clean the house, if you leave the house empty, 7 more demons worse than before will come in and inhabit it. And in fact, I know this with addicts. There was a good friend of mine who was a man who had been in recovery for decades from alcohol. He worked the 12 steps, and he had done the 12 steps for many years. And AA had kind of reached its limits for him, and he decided he needed a richer story world to live in. So then he joined this church years before I got here. And, you know, such a wonderful human being. But his addictive nature held out. When he passed away, there were something like 12,000 LPs in his house that his poor widow had to figure out how to dispose of. Some of them were valuable, many of them weren't. And an equal number of cassette tapes and CDs. So he was, in fact, addicted to music. And then she found a toolbox, and this was never a handy guy who worked with things, a toolbox that was full of screwdrivers. And she finds this, and it's like, he was addicted when it came to screwdrivers. Cameras. There was 40 or 50 cameras and thousands of pictures. He was addicted to photography. And in fact, he was quite overweight. He was addicted to food. His addictive nature carried on. And, you know, you might say, well, he joined the church, everything should have been great. Well, no, that's not how it works in the church. Everything isn't great. It's much more like living in your 12-step routine, only the church has a far broader field of view. We're not just simply focused on, you know, whether or not you're drinking, but we're hopefully we've broadened out the field, and we're looking for shalom in more areas of life and ways to maintain that goodness. But part of Christian theology, at least within my tradition, is that we remain sinners until we die, and we are perfected finally by grace, not really by works. And that then is represented theologically. So, but Peterson's point here, I think, is very important. Oh, what's the guy's name? Is it Sibley? I can't recall, but talked about the fact that if you want to drive out addiction, you need a stronger love to drive it out. Okay? And that then displaces it. And I think you can represent this psychologically. You can represent this in terms of brain chemistry. It's been represented in terms of stories, and people have been experiencing this forever in all kinds of ways.
When people study drug and alcohol use, they often make an elementary mistake, which is to try to figure out why people use drugs and alcohol. That's not a smart thing to wonder. We know why people use cocaine. Cocaine directly stimulates the systems that produce positive emotion. So there's no mystery there. The mystery with cocaine is very, very simple. Why don't people take cocaine all the time until they die? That's the mystery, really, because you can get isolated rats to do that. So, and
isolated rats. So what's interesting is that here's the inclination that perhaps even rats need a bigger story to live within. And you might say, well, how much of a story can a rat handle? Well, not much. But isolated rats, they need community. Otherwise, if you isolate a rat, suddenly you can increase the possibility that rat will become an addict. Well, that's interesting.
For some people, alcohol has the same kind of effect, except it's mediated by opiates. But often what people have to do to get themselves out of an addictive process is to find something better to do to replace it. And so I would say the problem with the gadgets, and I mean, they're amazing things, is that they proximately interfere with medium to long-term goals, I would say.
See, now again, we're dealing in some of the same ways with Mattei here, that, okay, so what is the good? What is the good that human beings were made for? Well, we can stack up goods, and we can calibrate intermediate goods, like Sam Harris. Well, well-being. Well, we can say that to stop after one or two beers so that you don't become abusive towards your spouse, or you don't become neglectful towards your children, or you don't lose your job. Well, that's a good, and we can say that that's a good. But when we start expanding this outward, we're going to have big questions, and we need big stories in which the good should be located, and it has to be bigger than just my emotional sense at the moment, which tends to be where the materialist and the atheist keep bringing meaning back. Well, I can experience wonder. Oh, okay, you can experience it. But does that experience connect to larger purposes? Does it connect to something which is beyond yourself? Does it connect to something which is large enough to devote decades of your life towards, which is more important than just doing cocaine until you die?
And so I think the first thing you have to do to bring them under control is figure out what it is that their use is interfering with. It has to be something important, right? So you think, well, I want to do something important. Well, what is that? Oh, it could be personal. Maybe you want to have a relationship. You want to get married. You want to have kids. You want to have a career that's meaningful. You want to have a life. You want to have an Abrahamic adventure and be the father of nations, let's say. Well, you can't be ratting away on your cell phone and doing that. And so I think part of it is to set your sights high and make a plan and figure out who you could be and see if obsessive utilization of smartphone fits into that vision of nobility.
A friend of mine, there's an old Christian definition of sin, which is, well, what's your definition of sin? It's a goddamn waste of time. It's damned by God because it's a waste of time. It's a love of something. Now, civilization is a fine game to play, But if civilization destroys my marriage and destroys my career, well, it becomes a sin. And that's where Mate gets into the question of addiction. Well, what are the negative consequences? Well, how big a negative consequence? Well, I wake up a little grumpy the next morning because I didn't get enough sleep, because I stayed up too late, because I just had to play one more turn of civilization. You're getting into sin, but it's not a big sin. Well, if I destroy my life because I play computer games, well, now there's a bigger loss. But again, now we're getting into the bigger questions of value and of meaning and of story. Now here in this next clip, Peterson talks to, oops, oh no, I didn't put it in. Well, maybe I've got it up here in the queue. Yeah, Russell Brand. And talks to Russell Brand about the 12 steps and how to, this is from another clip channel.
12 steps and the model for handling addiction that I've written about myself in my book Recovery, because I want to see what you think of it. The 12 steps have anonymous fellowships, which if I were to belong to them, I wouldn't be able to say I belong to them without breaching their code of anonymity. But what's positive about this approach to addiction is, as we have discussed off mic, that it creates community, like the other people that have got a similar endeavour. And in fact, it was Jung that identified this solution. He said that like people that have got chronic addiction issues will struggle to change unless they have a spiritual realization of some kind and the support of a community.
Yeah. Well, and the spiritual realization component, that's actually supported by the relevant addiction literature. One of the classic cures for addiction is spiritual transformation. And the hardcore scientists have laid that out as a reality in the addiction literature.
I agree, because to use more secular language around that, a spiritual transformation could just be a change of perspective, a renewal.
It's a radical change of perspective.
Yeah. And typically in my experience, that's from a self-centered view, a self-obsessive view about getting your own needs met, a solipsistic, narcissistic perspective of life is.
See, now he's using predominantly psychological and philosophical categories, and Peterson keeps wanting to push him towards the theological. And this, again, because of, Peterson in that conversation he had at the Ayn Rand Institute, I think, talked about the fact that one of the things that he discovered as he was doing clinical work was that people would only get better once you got down to the theological level of conversation.
This is just an adventure where I go around trying to accumulate and accrue to, oh, wow, I'm here to be of service. That's sort of the transition
Right. Yes.
Microscopically. But in addition to community, like having connections between one another, the 12 steps themselves, I think, are an interesting model for transformation and shouldn't be overlooked. And in fact, what my book was about is, could that method be transposed to anybody who's interested in change? So I wanted to talk to you.
Well, in fact, the 12 steps is already transposed in so many ways. I mean, all you had to do, all these other recovery programs had to do was just slide out alcohol and put in narcotics or overeating or sex or one of these other video games or whatever it is. The 12 steps already, in a sense, transposed it out and made it more theoretical so that you could more easily slide things in, and of course taking out all of the sectarian knowledge and turning God into a higher power. That about strips it about as bare functionally as you can.
About that, to get your perspective on them. The first step is acknowledging that you are powerless over your addiction and that your life has become unmanageable. Just admitting I don't want to be in this situation.
So there's two parts to that admission. One is that you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And I guess there's three. You're in trouble and it's serious. Things could be better. And you don't have the wherewithal at the moment to make them better.
And that's a really nice distillation, in my opinion, of Christianity. At least, in a sense, Protestant Christianity. Remember, Jung was the son of a Reformed minister, rather unhappy one, but the son of a Reformed minister. And so when I talk about misery, deliverance, gratitude in my sermons, well, this is a lot of what this is.
So the thing that's interesting about that is there's a kind of radical humiliation and humility that goes along with that. So you say, I have a problem, and what I know at the moment isn't sufficient to solve it.
That's misery.
Great, because now you've opened yourself up to the possibility of learning something. Because you say, well, I don't know enough to fix this. It's like, okay, well, you could learn.
But now you have to turn your life over to a power higher than yourself. That's deliverance. And then if you work through the rest of the 12 steps, a lot of them is gratitude.
And one of the things that's so interesting about people is that if they decide they have a problem, and they also notice that they could learn, the probability that they will learn goes way up.
That's very interesting. You've actually conflated the first 3 steps there in your analysis of the first one, because the first one is admission that there's a problem. The second one is recognizing that things could improve, like coming to believe that power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity.
It's interesting how a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity gets translated into recognize that, in a sense, I can improve things. There's a contradiction there, because that a power greater than myself can restore me to sanity. And I think that's exactly where you get the Christian idea of, well, prayer. Okay, I am going to give myself into this power. Now we get into the question about, okay, willpower versus illness. And I think part of the reason AA went to the illness thing is that locates us as a recipient in a secular frame rather than an agent. And I think that's part of the reason that language has worked well with AA.
And the third one is made a decision to turn our life and our will over to the care of...
Okay, now we get the agency in. And you see, so if an ideology is a crippled religion, AA really worked hard not to cripple Christianity in its application. So you both have recipient, I have to turn my life over to someone greater than myself, but there's decision in there. And it's this, a lot of people like to reduce Calvinism to determinism, which I think is an unfair reduction of Calvinism. But part of this conversation is always hinging on this question of, okay, I have to turn my life over. Well, is that choice? There you have the Arminian Calvinist conversation. When I turn my life over, is that me doing the choosing, or is this God choosing to me to do this? And
of God as we understood God. So, like,
and we could talk about that from a secular perspective. Well, we could talk about that from a secular perspective and say, well, there's a higher order moral principle that needs to be brought into the situation. And you sort of described that right at the beginning of the question, because you said, well, partly what you do when you move from an addicted state, from a psychological perspective, is move from a viewpoint of the gratification of immediate desire and maybe the accumulation of things as a marker of success, to the notion that, no, you actually have a higher purpose, and that higher purpose might involve being of service.
And that higher purpose, this is a broader story. This is a bigger story to live within. It's bigger than my immediate pleasure. And as we've talked about with Peterson before, we are very willing to exchange, I will suffer for the sake of purpose. We're in many ways, we're also bringing in Viktor Frankl. And if you've never read Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, it's a very worthwhile little book to read. And Viktor Frankl, in fact, established a whole school of psychology about this, that he found people that were suffering, well, get meaning. So Viktor Frankl goes to the concentration camp because he's a Jew in Nazi Germany, and he's there and he begins to observe. And, well, he's there anyway. He might as well find some meaning in his suffering. So he begins observing what's going on, and he begins to recognize that those who had no purpose died, and those who had purpose survived. And in many ways, their purpose needed to be outside the camp, because the Nazis were so brutal that they intentionally humiliated and took away purpose. And Peterson talks about bringing the sacks of, dragging the sacks across the yard just to destroy purpose. And so Frankl figures out that with purpose, people can, again, Nietzsche too, endure almost any, if they have a why, they can endure almost any how or even what. And so Frankl, what he did with his patients was then, okay, well, let's find purpose in your life. You're a mother. Find purpose in being a mother. You're a doctor. Find purpose in being a healer. Now we're back in Augustine's territory, because we say, okay, but if you find all of your purpose as a mother, becoming a mother can be idolatrous. So what you actually need is something at the top of the hierarchy that is incorruptible. Well, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? Well, God. Well, because God, for all kinds of various theological reasons, God is incorruptible by definition, because he's perfectly good. So he can't be corrupted. God is the only safe thing to have at the top of the hierarchy, because you can't bribe him and he won't use you outside of good purposes. And so that's why in a Christian schema, God is at the top of the hierarchy and not you, because this is where what Russell Brand was talking about at the beginning of this. If you are at the top of your own hierarchy, now suddenly you will become servant to all of your desires, and even something like alcohol can become your master. And so what you see here is that in this conversation about addiction, very quickly, this natural law perspective that says that there is an order to human reality, that there is a story, and it's not an arbitrary story, but there is a structure defined by story, represented by story, which has ordered loves that, if followed correctly, can actually produce shalom, not only in the small calibrations, but cycling all the way out into the large ones. That's what we're talking about here. And again, you can watch the Russell Brand Jordan Peterson conversations. I thought were excellent. Now, Ali starts the first part of the conversation, and then David picks him up later. And David talks to Mate about Jung. Now, where I'm going with this is going to be long, but I haven't done it for a while. What's interesting about Mate to me is I think he gets a lot right about addiction, but I don't know, when I listen to him, and maybe it's unfair, I haven't read his book, I don't know much about him, maybe in a longer conversation, maybe if I had a higher resolution of him, I'd be able to treat him more fairly. So I want to be very cautious, because I don't want to treat him unfairly. But the way in which he talks to me exposes the weakness of the secular frame. Now, he's going to start talking about Jung, and he's going to wander over into Peterson.
And you talked before about the realm of the hungry ghosts, and that's a Buddhist metaphor. Do you find the Jungian framework to be useful, the idea of the shadow and integration of the shadow?
Now David and Ali use a lot of the shadow work, and they do a lot of that in terms of their larger purpose for their channel and the men's work that they do, and so on and so forth. So I'm not surprised that David would ask this question. Mate's answer was kind of interesting.
In this work?
Well, we all have our shadow side, which has to be integrated. I mean, there's a part of me that's full of rage and hatred and jealousy and envy and
Now, what's interesting here is that, now I don't know a lot about Jung, but I've been slowly educating myself in Jung. The shadow is not just wrong. And when I listen to people talk about the shadow, I hear them saying the shadow is bad. In Jung, shadow isn't bad. Shadow is the opposite side of the persona. Well, what's the persona? The persona is the face that we create that seeks the approval of those around us. Okay? And the shadow are the elements of ourselves that we wish to hide. Because if you're going to have selection, well, here's the bigger story. There's a bigger story going on around you. And in that bigger story, in that bigger morality, there are things that are approved of and things that are disapproved of. Tim Keller, in his book on preaching, makes a very interesting story that if you were a Viking, your persona would be a Viking persona. If you were a man, you would be large, and this is how we imagine Vikings to be. Might be fair or unfair to the Vikings, but I will suffer no injury to my dignity. We'd be ready to be violent in a moment, so on and so forth. That would be the Viking's persona. Well, the Viking shadow side would then be, well, I just beat up that poor schmuck, and his wife and children are now suffering, and kind of feel bad about that. That's on his shadow side. Well, today, it's almost the reversed. If you're walking down the street, if you're an urbane New York male who's very concerned about toxic masculinity, you're going to be a masculine, you're going to be a male figure of emotional availability. Now Nietzsche could pop in here and say, yeah, you're only doing that to to have sex with the chicks. But anyway, so what I'm saying here is that shadow does not mean simply evil. Shadow and persona are connected, and they're connected not only in terms of the individual, but they're a reflection of the society that the individual is with. All right? So when we talk about integrating our shadow, we're talking about the fact that, okay, well, we've got these things in us which are unpopular in terms of the rest of the society, and so therefore we hide them, and this business about hiding and trying to keep them down, well, we never fully hide. This is then fertile ground for addiction. So shadow is not just evil. Shadow is that which society or whatever the group that you are associating with is discouraging. Yet you still have these things, and you have to figure out what to do with them. So, this is all a very complex game. It's not just simply good and bad. It's very complex, and it's very tied into the larger stories that are going on around you.
Sometimes homicidal fantasies. That's just a part of me. Nothing wrong with that. As long as I'm aware that they're in me and they're not me.
See, and even, I would love to probe him a little bit more on some of this, because I don't think that he's quite fair to Jung, and I think he's also adopting a rather, his persona is showing in this answer. I'll say it that way.
My problem with Jungianism, however, is that it ascribes these qualities to the shadow side, to something of an archetypical thing. They don't talk about trauma very much. Whereas I think, and this is what I point out in my book, In a Realm of Hunger Ghosts, is that these dark impulses in people and the need to escape from them actually arise out of genuine human experience. They're not simply part of human nature.
Now this gets really interesting, and this gets really complicated, because on one hand, the science of trauma has been very effective, and I think, Bessel van der Kolk, in terms of The Body Keeps the Score, wonderful book on trauma, which I have read. I haven't read this guy's book. I would like to read this guy's book. We'll see if I get time to it. There's way too many books I would like to read. And so, yeah, Jung didn't know a lot about trauma. That's partly a function of when he's doing what he's doing. A lot of the awareness of trauma and the dynamics of trauma have come later. And so, we can forgive Jung. Now he's talking Jungianism, so the followers of Jung. But these questions of, the question of trauma is not dislocated from all of these other deeper questions of ought and ordered loves and right and wrong. People are now, part of the Peterson conversation has been that people assert that they are being traumatized because their gender expression is not being validated and affirmed by others in their community and important people in their relational matrices. Okay, so that then is trauma. And when I listen to Mate, I almost get later when he's going to talk about Peterson, I almost get the sense that he says, well, what we need to do is avoid trauma. Well, now we're getting into the Jonathan Haidt coddling of the American mind conversation, where we say, if you look back on, say, pre-human world culture, evolution is a lot of trauma. Nature is red in tooth and claw for a long, long time. And this, for many people, then causes very difficult questions about the goodness of God or the existence of God. Now we suddenly get into our modern realm and we think, well, we're going to be able to engineer a world in which there is no trauma. Well, now we're getting theological and eschatological again, because we're almost saying, well, you look at biblical eschatological terms, well, there's no death or dying or tears or even sighing. And that's something that I've been thinking about lately because, for example, when I was driving with my family to the funeral and processing the grief of my sister, every now and then I would sigh. And when I would sigh, my wife would just put her arm out and, rub my shoulder. She'd hear my sigh. Well, what do we do when we sigh? We're often processing pain. Well, these questions get very big and very hard. And Mate almost imagines, again, one of the weaknesses of the present secular state, which is, well, you have to bring heaven into this frame. You have to eliminate trauma from people's lives. Really? How are you going to do that? Because one person's assertion is another person's trauma.
They're really outcomes of trauma. And that trauma is experienced in childhood. And in my view, unless you deal with the trauma, you're not really dealing with the shadow side.
And again, Peterson it would be interesting to have Peterson have a conversation with this guy, because Peterson would contest some of these things.
It's one thing to acknowledge that the shadow side is there, but if you look at
But again, see, I don't think he understands what, at least my understanding of what the shadow is for Jung, which is the shadow is the opposite of the persona. The shadow isn't simply evil or the bad. It's because of the social construct in which we live, it's the pieces of us that hide. And so the Viking would hide his tender side, and the modern urbanite would hide his Viking side. And so then the idea of integration is that, well, you're going to have to, you are part Viking and part sensitive person, and you're actually going to have to do the hard work of figuring out when it's important to be a Viking and when it's important to be sensitive, and to integrate both of those things into your life.
You look at the traumatic basis of it. So I do think that Freudianism and even Jungianism, Jung is much more sophisticated, I think, than Freud is, and has much more meaningful things to say about human functioning, for all the great insights that they both had, and I learned a lot from both. But they both ignore trauma. And I think the trauma is the missing piece in modern psychology and modern education, modern medicine.
I'd love to hear more about this, because really, can trauma be eliminated in this world as it is? And is that, are we knocking on the door of Jonathan Haidt's criticism of safe spaces and what he has to say about cognitive behavioral therapy, where the important thing is to make people stronger?
And so I think that without looking at trauma, speaking of the shadow side, remains somewhat shallow.
Interesting. And you're from Canada.
Yeah.
One of the biggest phenomenon of the last couple of years has been Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
What have you made of him, his rise, and what it says about the culture that people are so thirsting for what he's talking about?
Peterson, first of all, was very bright, extraordinarily articulate, and in some...
Now, part of what's difficult about asking, let's assume that Gabor Mate is a high status person who's he's an MD. I'm sure he's writing books. He's got a day job. He's doing all this stuff. How much Jordan Peterson does he really know? Probably not a lot. Usually people like him have maybe had a chance to read or just skim through 12 Rules for Life. And that's part of the problem about Jordan Peterson having conversations with people, that really, I think in all fairness, Peterson is the kind of thinker that if you really want to engage him, you need to have a pretty high resolution view of him. Otherwise, and maybe that's true of all of us, maybe I'm dealing with Mate unfairly because of my low resolution view of him. That's part of the nature of being creatures in time and space, but he'll go on here.
He's a compelling speaker, so he's an attractive figure in some ways. When I read him, I sense a lot of suppressed rage in him. In fact, I think his voice is choking with rage a lot of the time. It's interesting because he talks about rage, that you have to deal with it. I don't think he understands just how angry he is.
I find this comment very interesting, because it's always tempting to play armchair psychologist with someone through a book, and maybe your comments are fair and accurate. Maybe they aren't, but so Peterson's full of rage. I have no idea. Maybe he is, but I found this observation. Just very interesting.
And if you look at his websites, the comments are full of rage.
Now, I think in terms of the larger community, it's a little bit easier, a little bit fairer. And I think part of that is true in terms of part of what the Peterson phenomena is a combination of the man and the moment. And part of this has been anger. Anger for, loss of male privilege, let's say. Anger for a loss of white privilege, let's say. Anger for we're feeling chaos and we want to hit back. So I'm not ready to diagnose Peterson psychologically and play his armchair. Well, maybe I do that with I'm his armchair pastor, but in terms of the phenomenon, in terms of the audience, yeah, I can see that.
By his young acolytes. Now that's an energetic thing. That it's his energy that draws people as much as what he actually teaches.
Oh, I should do a words that fudge on energy. Oh, that word is used. That word is used a lot, like spiritually.
Secondly, he teaches repression. I mean, he very rightly takes an issue where somebody mandates a certain kind of language, and he very rightly and righteously says that I will not be dictated to about what language I'm going to use. Well, good for him. I'm all in favor of not mandating language, on the one hand. On the other hand, he basically advocates repression. In his book, he talks about how an angry 2-year-old child...
Now, before we go too far in this, suppression is a conscious decision to push down something. Repression is an unconscious decision. Can we make a decision unconsciously to push down, force away, or avoid? Did he mean suppression?
Needs to be sit by themselves until they get over it, rather than understanding why a child would be angry at age 2.
And this to me gets, well, maybe I'm an angry man too. But when I read Peterson in terms of, Peterson is saying, well, what you're doing with that 2-year-old is teaching that 2-year-old to master and order their emotional world. And that's what we call socialization. And I've known parents who have never wanted to cross their child or suppress their little spirits. And what they often created were children that were really annoying to be around. I've known some of these people long enough that a number of their children have grown up to be, decent human beings. And so, whereas I'm much more of an advocate of more the Petersonian old school, teach a child to control themselves, that would be suppression. But also, I think, when I listen to Mate, and then maybe, again, I'm being unfair with him, well, what are you teaching? See, this gets into the tricky thing of dealing with addiction. Because on one hand, willpower alone theologically isn't the way to actually handle an addiction. Suppression is not an effective tool. And in fact, almost the definition of addiction is that suppression hasn't worked. And so what Peterson said in the earlier video, very much in terms of, I wish I could remember that. I think it was at 8. He was a Reformed theologian. You need a stronger power to come in and drive that other thing out. Now again, that is representational language, and it is language of a story. And as Jonathan Peugeot tweeted a few weeks ago, science is just as much a heuristic as storytelling. They're all representations. I think that's the takeaway from the Don Hoffman work. But you need something to drive it out. Well, part of building that up is, in fact, the work that Peterson advocates in terms of childhood socialization, is that you set the child down and you say, okay, you're going to master your emotions. You're going to master your appetites. You're going to master your will. Now, there might be some things that come along that you cannot master. Well, then we turn our lives over to a higher power, because there are things in this world that we can't master. But there are other things in this world that we should master. And again, I think Mattei, maybe he's not doing this, maybe I'm just reading this into him, is indulging in the overly aggressive egalitarian thinking that says any sort of hierarchy is illegitimate and tyrannical. And whereas Peterson would say all hierarchies have the capacity for tyranny, hierarchies also have the capacity for good order. And in fact, hierarchies are natural and normal and necessary for even the small calibration flourishing of life.
What frustrations they're having and what human contact they need to help them move through that anger. He says repress the anger. So he's all about repressed anger as far as I'm concerned. And it's very interesting how he talks about children. He talks about little varmints and little monsters and so on. I know that's meant to be humorous, but it's also a certain way of thinking of the young human child. So fundamentally, I see him as an agent of repression.
Repression or suppression? So it's interesting, too, here, where he draws, you shouldn't call children like that. Well, it's very, very interesting that the subtle dynamics of language with respect to the larger worldview conversations that we are processing today. Children are sometimes, we call them little varmints, and they're also image bearers of God. And what happens in a fully formed religion is that you're able to, in fact, keep both ideas present and both ideas in balance.
He posing as an agent of libertarianism. Not to mention, he's got this bee in his bonnet about what he considers to be, seems to consider to be conspiracies by left-wing intellectuals. They seem to be his bête noire. Being a left-wing intellectual myself, I like to talk to him sometimes. What are you so upset about, Jordan? What are you so afraid of?
Well, you should watch his videos. He'll tell you what he's so afraid of and what he's so upset about.
You know, he talks about these bloody Marxists. And he points out very accurately all the horror that occurred under so-called Marxist regimes, particularly in the Soviet Union. He's absolutely accurate about that. But then he promotes Christianity. Shall I tell him about the mass murders that occurred in the name of Christianity?
Do you really want to compare the murders that occurred in the name of Christianity versus the murders that occurred in the name of Marxism? Are those numbers you really want to hold against each other?
Should I tell him about all the millions that were slaughtered in the names of the gentle Jesus? In other words, let's be fair about it. He seems to pick ideologies to attack and abhor and embrace other ideologies that are just as murderous in practice sometimes. It's a much more interesting question.
Now, what's interesting here is a bunch of things. Marxism and ideologies. Peterson says ideologies are crippled religions. And what he means by that is, on one hand, ideologies have not had a long-term tested and benefited creating a well-roundedness. And so what you tend to have with religions are so let's say times when Christianity gets murderous. Well, there are resources within Christianity to critique and counteract that murderous side. And so what happens with religions, because they've been around a very long time, is that you start to get balance. And when Christianity gets out of balance, as it did, let's say, in the time of the Reformation and the bloody religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, I mean, things started to happen then to try to correct that balance without losing it. So, Christians, the person who killed me was a Christian, therefore Christianity is wrong. The person who killed me is an atheist, therefore atheism is wrong. you've got to kind of discern these things and weigh these things. And so when Peterson distinguishes an ideology from a religion, he's basically saying that religions, they can become ideological too, but religions have within them the resources to have a more well-rounded critique of itself, so that when they get out of balance, they can work themselves back into balance. They carry with them a telos and purpose, without authority from above, and often without examination. That's what happens in ideologies, and especially secular ideologies. That what all of these ideologies are, they're asserting a telos. Well, let's say Nazism is racial purity or evolution of racial identity. Let's say Marxism is a material utopianism, an evolution of class consciousness and achievement. Okay? Well, there are reductions in these ideologies which are probably fatal. And you reduce a human being, let's say with Nazism, to their racial identity, or you reduce a person, let's say with Marxism, to their class identity. Well, people do have racial identities, people do have class identities, but to say that these are their defining elements is to reduce a human being, and I think both of these attempts failed, partly because the reduction itself failed, and people can't be reduced to these things. What religions try to do is maintain much larger identities and distill them down. This gets into the fairy tale conversation. Distill them down into incredibly time-tested, well-compacted ideas, such as, I'm cleaning up Peterson's language here, Christians are image bearers of God. Now, image bearers of God is an idea that is so compact and so well tested. See, when I criticize Peterson's divine spark, image bearer, because image is located in a variety of things, and bearer, okay, a bearer is different from an asserter. It's someone who has received something. I mean, this is just so time tested and tightly packed for thousands of years that it's durable, and it stood the test of time, and it's there for a reason. And this is where ideologies continue to topple over, and they can't withstand time, because in kind of a Darwinian sense, they're tried and they fail. They're tried and they fail. And that which has come to us in the form of religions are things that have endured, and they've been, over time, they've been refined. Again, I often refer to Alistair McGrath's book Heresy, where he looks at these ancient Christian heresies, and he sees how, well, heresy and theology, heresy and orthodoxy are kind of pairs that refine together. You didn't know the right answers to questions until you tried and failed with worse ideas. Well, Jesus received his divine nature. Well, they worked on that for a while. Said, no, that can't be it. So then you have Orthodox Christology, and then you have the idea of the Trinity, and then you work on that for a while. And it takes hundreds, even thousands of years, and these things keep getting tested, and communities embody them, and even these foundational things. Peterson talks about that in his in one of his sections in the 5-part Easter conversation. These things become the foundation that get expressed in communities, and if you have a poor foundation, the weaknesses of that foundation will be seen over multiple generations of human being and tried over time. And so this is some of the logic of theology, and why theology works the way it does, and why ideologies just continue to fail. Now, watch the whole Rebel Wisdom interview. The whole thing is worth watching, and I'm very interested in reading Matei's book. I don't know if it's quite up high enough on my hierarchy to read it. Lately, I've been reading, when I was in Massachusetts for the living in my mother's basement, for the the death of my sister, I picked up again C.S. Lewis's Grief Observed, and then that got me thinking about Joy Davidman, and so then I picked up this biography, which was written just a few years ago about Joy Davidman, and I'm finding it a fascinating and timely read, because Joy Davidman in the early 20th century was an ardent woman liberationist, and she was an intellectual leader in the American communist movement. She was an outspoken atheist, and she has a very interesting conversion, and the whole book is a fascinating study in so many things that pertain to the Jordan Peterson conversations that we've been having. She becomes a Christian. She's not a very good Christian. She wanders off into L. Ron Hubbard land and Dianetics for a while and gets tangled in that. She basically decides to set up her husband for adultery and stalks C.S. Lewis and manages to marry him. And I mean, the whole story is just C.S. Lewis's story is very interesting, but I think hers may be more interesting still. And because of all the hagiography, all of the desire to turn C.S. Lewis into a saint. Now, I'm as big a fan as anyone I know of C.S. Lewis, but you've got all the muddledness and complexity and sinfulness of human beings in this story. And I appreciate this biography because she doesn't sugarcoat things. Both Joy Davidman's strengths and her weaknesses, and where she just did wrong, where she just wronged her family, where she wronged her husband. And her husband was, I didn't have a good appreciation of Bill Gresham until this book. And I think I'm dependent upon the book, of course, and to whatever degree the book is true and relates to the history of them. But it's just such a believable story in terms of what amazing messes we human beings are. And in that story, there's Marxism, and there's atheism, and there's liberationism, and there's alcoholism, and there's all of these things wrapped in together. So I'm not finished with the book yet, but my books always ride on a hierarchy, and when I get caught on a book like this, if it's very timely, I can't let it go. So maybe I'm addicted to books, but I haven't lost my job or my marriage over my addiction to books yet, although there are times when my wife gets a little upset because, do you really want to talk to me, or do you really want to read that book? So these are things one deals with. But here Mattei is talking about Marxism, and he's a left-wing intellectual. Okay, but here's the funny thing about Marxism, which the book nicely illustrates, that so many people wander over there because they're, and myself included in my younger years, well-meaning but simplistic response to the inequality and suffering. Jordan Peterson, I think, has a devastating critique of that, where he shows that inequality is way deeper than capitalism. And what's interesting about this book is that Joy Davidman and Bill Grisham, these were card-carrying members of the Communist Party, and they embraced that ideology as a way of answering the deep questions in their lives, both of them as atheists. And then they both then wander into Christianity, and they're not perfect Christians, but they're being sometimes held up by Christian press as ideal Christians to be emulated, but their lives weren't always that ideal in terms of a Christian frame. But what's interesting is that Marxism is so susceptible to money, of all things, and affluence. And I'm old enough to remember the Cold War and the stories coming out of the Soviet Union and the corruption of these high communist leaders who are living in affluence while the bread lines and the stores are empty of consumer products. And you look at the Chinese situation where they're practicing communism, and but capitalism is just a heck of a lot more fun because there's so much more stuff to it. And so they try to maintain one-party rule while, completely abdicating this critique of capitalism and wholeheartedly embracing it, or most of the way embracing it. And you find this in Bill Grisham and Joy Davidman's life. When they start making a little money, they buy a big house in the suburbs. This is just after World War II, when the suburban movement just gets going, and they join a mainline church, and they hire a maid, and communism goes out the window once they get a little bit of money. And that reminds me of Peterson's quip about, we wouldn't have as many leftist profs if they were paid more. And I kind of think, he's really got a point, because Marxism seems to be destroyed by prosperity. Capitalism swallows Marxists through basic human desires. Well, then the question is addiction the bane of secular capitalist affluence? When we take these things with our heart's desire, and when we become the center of our world, the center of our lives, as Russell Brand says, well, suddenly we're eaten by our own desires. In other words, you need a hierarchy, and you need something at the top of that hierarchy. And whatever's at the top of that hierarchy cannot be corrupted. And when you've got a system like that, when now you're dealing with all of the elements, you've got a community around you, you've got something at the top of the hierarchy, you've got a system like that, you've got a bigger story to live within. Well, Grisham and Davidman were by no means perfect people, but suddenly you begin to recalibrate things on a small scale, and then hopefully, as you continue to work it and develop it and pursue it in your life, it gets larger and larger and larger too. Now, I don't want to necessarily echo what I think Peterson's weakest element to his work is, which is, again and again, he'll say, well, we can overcome these things. Well, let's overcome all we can. Absolutely. But I'm a Calvinist, and I believe in the age of decay, that there's a lot we don't overcome. We don't overcome death. We don't finally overcome corruption. And this is where the balance language, okay, we want to keep these things in balance. Balance is never consummation. Balance is always an approximation to be as good as we can get it within the confines of this frame, which are far larger than us. We get back into eschatology, we look at ultimate goods. What the purpose of things are. Our renovation into something, as C.S. Lewis said, the likes of which we would be tempted to worship if we saw it on the street. And that's, in a sense, where I think why we have difficulty talking about addiction. Why we have difficulty dealing with addiction. Because finally, just as in the wisdom of the 12-step program, you need a power greater than yourself. And there's an element of power in it, which means it can impact us down here. But there also is an element of authority in it. And now if I go back to my little diagram that I've been working, the square has to be complete, or the rectangle has to be complete. There's authority from above, how things ought to be. You have the unification of heaven and earth with empiricism from below, and you have the past and the future all coming together. And that's when we begin to experience, I think, the shalom that we were made for. So there's a few comments, maybe an hour and a half's worth of comments. So as someone mentioned on Twitter, look forward to my, I forget what word he used, but yeah, if I'm away from this for a while, I get a lot of ideas and just got to get them out. Let me know if it's helpful. Again, love the work that Rebel Wisdom is doing. Very much enjoying their interviews, and much love to David and Ali, and yeah, it's fun stuff. So let me know what you think in the comment section.